Welcome to WHRO's Weekly Edition. I'm Doug Boynton. In this week's program, we'll take a look at the two new ferries that Hampton Roads Transit unveiled. WHRO's Ryan Murphy examines the Port of Virginia's economic boom and its impact outside the gates. Then WHRO military reporter Steve Walsh brings us inside the Navy's substandard living problem and how it's part of a larger military issue.
We don't have barrack space. We are not allowed by law to pay them house allowance for them to go find themselves an apartment in town.
It's WHRO's Weekly Edition. A new report from the Chesapeake Bay Foundation highlights oysters as a tool to fight climate change. We get the story from WHRO's Catherine Hafner.
The nonprofit says it's entering the next chapter of oyster restoration, focused on tackling climate change. Oysters store carbon dioxide that would otherwise be released and warm the planet. Reefs also protect shorelines during storms by absorbing wave intensity. Here's Chris Moore with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation.
Oysters really can be a part of the solution to this very complex problem here in the Chesapeake Bay region.
He says the local oyster population has gone through a boom and bust cycle in recent decades. The foundation is now calling on state officials to help prevent any more busts. They recommend things like setting oyster harvest quotas and boosting the aquaculture industry. Catherine Hafner, WHRO News.
Efforts to encourage private development at Fort Monroe and Hampton have been stymied by the fort's outdated utilities. Ryan Murphy has more on the long-running effort to get more dirt turning.
Issues with the fort's power and gas lines complicate efforts to build on the old Army installation. Governor Glenn Youngkin says the state needs to fix the utility issue to capitalize on the promise of Fort Monroe.
We need to press forward with this in order to give developers the confidence that in fact the fort will be the kind of place that they're willing to invest. But sometimes, we have to invest in front of that.
Youngkin's proposed budget includes $50 million towards the utilities overhaul. Fort Monroe officials say that's a great start, but to revamp all of the fort's utilities will take something like $200 million. The fort recently lost a planned project including a new hotel, restaurants, and redeveloped marina after costs for the development spiraled out of control. The developer in that case says the utilities weren't as much of an issue as other costs associated with building on historic property. Ryan Murphy, WHRO News.
This week, Hampton Roads Transit debuted two brand-new ferries for its only water route. WHRO's Laura Fillion covered the story.
Mayors Shannon Glover and Kenny Alexander cut the ribbon on Elizabeth River Ferry 6 to cheers, bells, and bubbles. Ferries 6 and 7 are the two long-awaited additions to Hampton Roads Transit's ferry fleet that runs between Norfolk and Portsmouth. In late 2023, HRT auctioned off Ferry 3, which was 38 years old when it left service. The new ferries have a federally mandated lifespan of 25 years. Laura Fillion, WHRO News.
Sexual assaults and other major crimes are now handled by a new Navy Special Trial Council. It is part of a congressional effort to instill confidence in military justice. One of the two new regional offices is in Norfolk. WHRO military reporter Steve Walsh sat down with the head of the program, Rear Admiral Jonathan Stevens.
Admiral, tell me how this is going to work.
Ultimately, many of the things in the steps are just the same as they happen now, right? So prior to this, we've had prosecutors who worked with, in our case, NCIS, typically on these kind of more serious cases, to help investigate, to help make decisions and recommendations. The difference is before they were making recommendations to the commanders on what cases should go forward, and now we will be making those decisions on our own.
Why do commanders have a role in military prosecutions?
Well, and I think that all goes back to, back in the day with good order and discipline, right? So it's important for commanders to be able to maintain good order and discipline on their crews so that they can operate efficiently. But I do think that there's an argument that certain prosecutorial decisions on these more serious cases are probably better set with the JAGs. And so that's kind of how we got here. I think ultimately that's what Congress decided.
We're still seeing cases where high-ranking officers are allowed to retire with pay. I thought the law was supposed to get rid of this.
So I'm not familiar with any of those cases. All I can say is that generally, what the law, I think, was designed to do is ensure that we have prosecutors who are experienced, not just as prosecutors, but have dealt with these types of cases or have had, training. And so in the Navy, we've tried to leverage our military justice track to handle these cases. And so each case is a fact to its own. And so there are some cases that maybe on the lower end of the scale that perhaps warrant those types of plea agreements and others that don't.
So how will things change for the victims?
So for the victims, we're hoping that by having more experienced people on the cases sooner, we're going to be engaging with them a little bit sooner. That's our goal that we've kind of put into our SOPs to ensure that they have a voice and ensure that they understand. I think there are going to be cases just that they don't agree with our decisions, but we will have, our goal is to have worked through them so that if we make a decision that they don't agree with, that's not a surprise to them. So we will be working with them throughout the process.
So how do you rebuild trust?
We'll hope that we can rebuild the trust, right? And I think for me, one of the keys is kind of communication with all the stakeholders. And, working with victims, working with their counsel earlier and consistently throughout the process, working with commanders to let them know that while they aren't making the decisions anymore, there still is a role for them, so says Congress, right, in the process. And so I think, but then everybody understanding that we are making, through communicating with everybody, if people understand that we are making these decisions independent and based solely on our kind of analysis of the evidence, that hopefully some of the, maybe if there were appearance issues on commanders or whomever making decisions, that hopefully those will dissipate a bit, right? Our goal is to, do justice and try to make sure that the process is as fair and transparent for everybody involved, not just the victims and the commanders, but also those who are accused of offenses.
Right. Thank you. Rear Admiral John Stevens, head of the new Navy Office of Special Trial Counsel. Thank you so much for this.
That was WHRO military reporter Steve Walsh. Virginia Beach says the cost of recycling is definitely going up, but as WHRO's Catherine Hafner reports, residents say they may be willing to pay for it.
The city's recycling contract ends in June, and vendor TFC Recycling has said it can't afford to extend the current terms. Public Works Director L.J. Hansen told City Council this week that means one thing.
If we choose to retain curbside recycling, costs will rise sharply.
That would mean doubling the monthly recycling fee from about $3 to $6. The city recently surveyed residents about recycling and got a record response of almost 10,000 people. More than a third say they're willing to pay more to keep curbside recycling. A lot fewer people preferred an opt-in program or switching to drop-off locations. Norfolk is also weighing what to do when its recycling contract expires this summer. Catherine Hafner, WHRO News.
Virginia Beach delegate Barry Knight lost his seat on the House Appropriations Committee last week without an explanation. WHRO's Michelle Hankerson reports that, at least publicly, politicians are still staying quiet.
The unexpected removal was a rare change that happened 5 days before the committee was due to present its version of the state budget. Knight's been a longtime budget negotiator between the House of Delegates and the Senate. The two chambers have to ultimately agree on one budget to send to the governor. Knight was shifted to the Transportation Committee. He declined to comment about the reassignment. Speaker of the House Don Scott of Portsmouth makes committee assignments. Last week, Scott told WHRO he had no official comment about Knight's reassignment. He says members often get moved around. Michelle Hankerson, WHRO News.
More COVID-19 relief is coming to North Carolina commercial fishermen and fish houses that lost money during the pandemic. Public Radio East's Annette Weston Riggs has more.
The North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries has sent a total of $1.2 million to more than 200 fishermen and 35 seafood dealers from the federal North Carolina Consolidated Appropriations Act Fisheries Relief Program, or the CARES Act 2. Under the program, applicants had to document a total loss of revenue of more than 35% and confirmed that when combined with other CARES Act relief, the funding wouldn't result in overcompensation for their financial losses in 2020. After the initial allocation of more than $4.3 million was distributed, that leftover $1.2 million has been used to help those who were not fully compensated through prior coronavirus economic relief programs. I'm Annette Weston-Riggs.
The Port of Virginia handled overflow when other U.S. ports were overloaded with cargo during the pandemic. That led to unprecedented growth. And that growth has now translated to tons of economic activity outside the terminal gates. WHRO's Ryan Murphy has the story.
It's a cold afternoon in December, and Sam Kinlock is practicing parallel parking. But he's not doing it in a sedan or a minivan. It's a white-on-white tractor trailer. He's training to earn his commercial driver's license.
Yeah, I definitely got a feel for the driving. It's just the books part of it I'm a little nervous about, so I'm working on that.
Kinlock is a student at Tidewater Community College. When cargo traffic at the Port of Virginia went through the roof during the pandemic, there was suddenly not enough truck drivers.
It's not enough to just bring the product in, but we've got to be ready to move the product out.
That's Laura Hansen, TCC's interim vice president of Workforce Solutions. TCC already had semester-long classes for trucking, but started an expedited 4-week class for CDL certifications in 2022. The college started with monthly classes. Now it's firing a new class every 2 weeks, and Hansen says they still can't keep up.
Even if we tripled our output, we'd come nowhere close to meeting the demand in the region.
The driver shortage is just one of the symptoms of the millions of additional tons of cargo now flowing through the Port of Virginia. When online shopping spiked during lockdown, many U.S. ports weren't ready for the influx of cargo. In 2021, container ships were lined up outside harbors in Los Angeles and Georgia. But the Port of Virginia had finished some major expansion projects right before COVID hit. One of them is the automated cranes at Norfolk International Terminal. They stack and move the colorful containers, gingerly setting them on waiting truck trailers. Virginia was able to take on the traffic other ports couldn't deal with. Here's port spokesman Joe Harris.
Trade was bananas. You didn't know you could move that much cargo. And the Port of Virginia, in that crazy period, really established a reputation as a port that can do. We never missed a beat.
Virginia's port handled 25% more containers in December 2021 than in the previous December. 2022 went on to be the port's busiest year ever. Harris says the port turned a lot of those pandemic-era visitors into repeat customers, and traffic at the port is still increasing. Nearly $1.5 billion worth of additional improvements to port facilities and the shipping channel will come online in the next couple of years, helping to move cargo quicker and attract even more business. And those businesses have needs beyond the terminal gates. More truckers to move cargo is one. Another is places to store that cargo, which has fueled a huge boom in warehousing. In Suffolk and Chesapeake, warehouse complexes sprawling across hundreds of acres are planned to take advantage of all the new business flowing through the port. Governor Glenn Youngkin said Virginia Beach's proximity to the growing port drove Amazon's decision to open a $350 million shipping facility in the city. And Old Dominion University is even starting up a whole new school to train students for the flourishing industry. The School of Supply Chain, Logistics, and Maritime Operations will start offering classes this fall and will have full degree-granting programs within the next couple of years. Ricardo Ungo will oversee the new school. He says one of the biggest challenges with his current business students is many simply don't know what kind of jobs exist at the port.
You can ask the students, where is the port? There. Okay, what do they do there? I don't know. Are there opportunities in the port for you? Silence. They have no idea.
And those jobs can be lucrative. The average wages across the ports and logistics industry are north of $73,000 at Hampton Roads, well above the region's average pay. Ryan Murphy, WHRO News.
This is WHRO's weekly edition. Remember, for any stories you've missed, you can visit us on the WHRO smartphone app or all social media platforms. Students in Virginia Beach City Public Schools will have an earlier start to the next school year. WHRO's Barry Graham has more.
A divided school board voted 5-4 Tuesday in favor of a pre-Labor Day start ending a decades-old policy that dated to the late 1980s. The board considered two options, the pre-Labor Day opening and keeping the start to the traditional first week in September. The 2024-25 school year will start August 26th and finish June 13th. The Teachers Association strongly supported the August start, while residents voted in an online survey in favor of the post-Labor Day opening. Both options had the mandatory 180 days of instruction. Barry Graham, WHRO News.
WHRO's Barry Graham discussed the calendar change with VBEA President Kathleen Slindy about the change and why the Teacher Association supported it.
What was the Virginia Beach Education Association's position on the earlier start date?
Well, actually, this Virginia Beach City Public Schools started before Labor Day this school year. Of the two, the only one that had days, staff days or planning days during the year for our teachers was the pre-Labor Day start. So it really wasn't a choice for our school division to ask teachers to work an entire year and to deal with the things that are coming down from the state, like the Virginia Literacy Act, all of that, and then the changes that are in the SOLs this year, to be able to give quality instruction and to be able to plan adequately, you have to have some staff days in the middle of the year to be able to do that. And so the pre-Labor Day was actually the only one that really made any sense.
Can you sum up in any manner what the opposition to the pre-Labor Day start was?
The opposition to pre-Labor Day start is one, tradition. Two is there's the understanding that if we started earlier like we did this year, that we should be getting out earlier in June, which didn't happen. So that was a misunderstanding when they chose the early start last year. When you think about, Virginia Beach being a high tourism area, they want to have people available, whether they're students or it could be college students, it could be high school students, and also many of our educators have second and third jobs that they work in the summer or after hours, and that's related to the tourism industry. So I think there's some pushback on that. When they did the survey for parents and community members, there were a number of people who preferred that start. But really and truthfully, when you talk about a school calendar as complicated as it is, and I have to say that the staff of our school division and all of the people who participate in the discussion, it's a lot of work, and there are a lot of parameters that you have to check the boxes for. So when we came out with the two calendars that we had the choice of, it really comes down to what's best for instruction for students. And so having a calendar that enables teachers to have the best possible chance of implementing these new changes and being prepared to instruct students, that's what we have to really look at. And I think that's how the decision was made.
Norfolk International Airport is getting $6 million to replace the customs facility that handles international travelers. WHRO's Laura Fillion brings us the latest.
The money will go toward a new federal inspection service facility. That's where customs officers process international travelers. The new facility will be able to process multiple planes at a time, something the current setup doesn't allow for. U.S. Senators Tim Kaine and Mark Warner wrote in a press release that timely processing would make airport operations safer. The funding is the latest in a number of grants to Norfolk International to expand and improve operations. Laura Fillion, WHRO News.
Navy sailors are forced to live on ships due to minimal housing even when they're back in port in the U.S. It is part of a larger military-wide problem of inadequate or substandard housing. WHRO's Steve Walsh reports.
USS Ramage returned to Norfolk in January after 8 months at sea, including a stint off the coast of Israel after war broke out in Gaza. It was the first deployment for Petty Officer Matt Redding, who was eager to get off the ship.
Yeah, I was pretty ready. Those last few months, we didn't really have any port visits for 2 months, so I was pretty ready to jump off the brow.
But back home in Norfolk, there's really no room for most junior sailors on shore. Redding is staying with a former shipmate off base. The Master Chief Petty Officer of the Navy, James Honey, told Congress that on average 800 sailors per aircraft carrier have to live on board ships, even after they come home from an extended deployment.
We don't have barrack space. We are not allowed by law to pay them house allowance for them to go find themselves an apartment in town. So they live on board the ship. That's the number one quality of life concern of our sailors who are currently on deployment. When we return from deployment, am I going to continue to live on this ship, or will I be able to find a barracks room and move into a bed and have separation from this workplace?
The Master Chief's comments went viral on social media. Sailors and former sailors say sleeping on the boat year-round makes life tough. Some say they lived in their cars until they found spots in the barracks or qualified for off-base housing allowance. Though they also said living in overcrowded barracks can be just as bad. Complaints of poor living conditions echo social media posts over the past several years as the Navy comes to terms with substandard housing.
And what we found is that none of the military services standards even met the standards that they are supposed to be meeting.
Elizabeth Field is the lead author of a General Accounting Office report released in September, which found evidence of mold, cockroaches, no running water, and sewage on the floors of military barracks. The services told investigators that 5,000 sailors and 17,000 Marines live in substandard housing. The Master Chief of the Navy asked Congress for funding to house junior sailors in the community. Field says that idea won't bypass the need for better barracks.
First of all, there may not be enough housing at that very low rent level in the local economy, but also unit commanders don't necessarily like it when their most junior enlisted service members are out. There's a concern about it impacting unit cohesion.
The Navy is also strapped for space in the barracks, though the Marines have a surplus. The Marines estimate only 55% of their barracks rooms are being used. Responding to complaints, the Marines recently ordered a service-wide inspection of all its facilities by March 15. Marine Sergeant Major Jason Hammock.
The inspections are going to identify where we can move Marines now, improving the occupancy of the good barracks and get them out of the bad barracks that we don't necessarily need.
The idea is to start abandoning the worst facilities and spending the savings on barracks that are in better shape. The Marines are also hiring civilians to oversee the barracks instead of relying on their own squad leaders.
We struggle with that because Marines kind of come and go. Now I have actually trained workforce that is meant to take care of barracks instead of a Marine that it's kind of his second job.
Housing for younger sailors and Marines has become a recruiting and retention issue right up there with pay, says Hammock. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General C.Q. Brown visited the USS Ramage and the USS Ford in Norfolk after their long deployment. He acknowledged that the military needs to find a way to allow sailors to live off their ships.
It's not something we're going to give up on, and we're going to continue to work and improve to make sure we do all the things to support, particularly our most junior service members and their families with adequate housing and support.
Though, at the moment, the Navy doesn't have a better alternative.
That was WHRO's military reporter, Steve Walsh. You've been listening to WHRO's Weekly Edition. We had help today from WHRO's Catherine Hafner, Laura Fillion, Ryan Murphy, Steve Walsh, Michelle Hankerson, and Gary Graham. Public Radio East's Annette Weston Riggs, also Connor Worley, who produced today's show. A reminder, you can always catch full episodes of the Weekly Edition podcast feed, and you can get your news updates at WHRO.org and the WHRO Reports podcast feed. For all of us at WHRO and WHRV, I'm Doug Boynton. Stay safe. Be well.